I'll go in. If there's mice in there, you can have it. I said, likewise, if there's snakes, you can have it.
But the work carried risks well beyond that of fighting off snakes and mice. Whether manning a gun, laying mines, or disassembling duds to analyze why they failed, JPG workers contributed to the war efforts by handling the ammunition before it was certified reliable for the field.
Was it easy to find people willing to go into that line of work?
You know what's amazing? There are hazardous jobs, and you can pay extra pay for hazardous jobs. Now let's say you tell a guy you're going to give him $1 extra an hour to put his life on the line during the day, and they'll take them. And you'd think $1 an hour is not worth it. I mean, who's going to do this trick? But you give them an extra pay. Say you give them an extra $40 a week, or extra $2,000 a year, and they would. These guys would be willing to do that.
Gun crews stood behind 2-foot-thick walls when firing live shells. The Proving Ground Fire Department and guards were on duty around the clock. Hudson says safety was the #1 concern. It had to be. Workers were dealing with devices designed to kill. Still, occasional mistakes led to injuries throughout the years, some serious. Twice, JPG workers were killed on the job. A great loss, but a small number compared to the massive amounts of testing through the years and the number of lives saved in combat.
I always figured that every day I came to work, I was proud of being here because I felt like I was saving lives. Because if we let that ammunition go out to the fields and you had your soldiers there firing that stuff and it didn't hit the target, then you had the enemy could come and overrun them. Or if it blew up in the tank, you'd kill our soldiers. So that's why I figured it was really important.
Do you feel like the work was appreciated?
In the local area?
Yeah.
No.
No?
Maybe it was by some, and I would say particularly veterans would appreciate it. But people that lived and had to put up with discomfort of noise and things of that, they weren't very appreciative of it, I'm sure.
A community that was rocked by the news when the Proving Ground was built, then rocked by the boom of construction, found itself then constantly barraged with testing. The concussion shook houses, broke windows, and shattered plaster.
Sometimes you say, well, I wonder what plate they're going to break today, and a lot of people, the impact was, it's very real,
Yeah.
I never thought of it as a war zone because at that age I wasn't really aware of what war was. But it certainly was,
And the community had a hard time accepting the fence. While her grandparents and uncle had lost their land to the Proving Ground, Browning's family lived just on the other side.
But we did utilize crawling under the fence and going back there for things.
Oh, yeah?
Blackberry picking, things like that.
And she wasn't alone. Despite landmines, unexploded shells, tests of every kind of ammunition, locals would sneak in all the time to hunt and fish. Or they would sometimes occasionally ignore the fence altogether.
This had an airspace clearance of 43,000 feet because the projectiles, as they would go up, artillery rounds would go way up in the air, see them go down range. You shoot them real high. So you couldn't have airplanes flying over this place with you shooting those projectiles up through there every day. You'd be surprised how right in the middle of the day, right in the middle of the program, here would come a little old Piper Cub or something, just come flying around and cry down across the firing line like he was in his right mind.
Despite these incursions, no person from the community was ever injured because of testing operations. But the same couldn't be said for property neighboring the perimeter.
I know of one case where the guy worked here, and that had a lot going for us. A round left the west side one morning, and it exploded in his front yard right by his porch.
No.
Now, that was sort of disconcerting to us.
During times of conflict, there would be 2 to 3 shifts working each day, virtually constant firing of shells. Generally, about 5% of the ammunition was rejected. As one of the mathematicians who had analyzed the testing data, Moore says he was under a lot of pressure, sometimes even harassment, from companies looking to secure their government order.
If we accepted it, it was wonderful because then the Army was going to buy like 200,000 rounds. If we rejected it,
They'd stop the production line, find out what was wrong, why the projectiles were up, and we'd put 2,000 or 3,000 people out of work.
We had a 3-day time it received from here, time it was received, processed, fired, and a decision made on it. 3 work days is all we had to make that decision in. And no one else could even come close to that. Still can't today. Even though they moved to Yuma, they still can't do that.
Hudson credits the Midwestern work ethic and ingenuity with keeping their customers happy and with keeping the proving ground open as long as it was. One local initiative involved finding ways to test smart landmines.
Made a presentation to the Army, and they was just floored. They could not believe that out in the field somebody had developed this capability to run these tests and make these measurements on smart munitions. Just a local guy. He really wasn't a formally educated engineer type guy. He's more of a self-made kind of a guy. Well, it turned into a real boom for us because we was the only place in the world could do it.
That ingenuity was vital because throughout the years, whenever the U.S. was at peace, JPG would be plagued by rumors that it would be shut down. After VJ Day, civilian demolition squads removed and destroyed an estimated 25,000 duds from the firing range. Some residents thought they would get their farms back and life would return to the way it was.
When the announcement was made to close JPG, the community was happy. The businesses were happy that this place was going to go out of business. Now, what they didn't stop and think about was that the economic impact of it going out of business was, because if you're putting $25 million a year in a community, and the economists, those people that do that stuff, say that a dollar will turn over about 7 times for every one you put in here, and you put $25 million a year in here and that turns over 7 times, that's a lot of money.
But peace would not last. Testing resumed when the U.S. became involved in Korea. For 40 years, like a roller coaster, when conflict subsided, so did the jobs. When the Vietnam War began, JPG's workforce doubled almost instantly. In 1975, the government again looked to shut down JPG. But by that time, the proving ground had become a fixture in Madison and in the local economy.
So in 1975, when I made a trip to Washington to visit the Undersecretary of the Army for installations, to make a presentation to him and all the Indiana senators and congressmen and Kentucky ones, they were all there, the place was completely packed. I took with me 25 businessmen from Madison. They insisted on going, not for any reason I didn't need them for any reason other than just for support from this community to show the government how important they believed it was to the community. So I took lawyers and bankers and newspaper people, and I took them all.
By the 1980s, JPG was one of only 3 major Department of Defense ammunition testing facilities. They were a patriotic and close bunch of employees.
It was just like a family, close-knit family.
Then, after decades of creating a testing community, once again, history would repeat itself.
Can you walk that one through me? Explain why?
In 1988, BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, recommended closing JPG. Its testing mission would be moved to the Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona. The BRAC Commission had been charged with reducing the number of military installations and saving taxpayer money. JPG looked like an attractive prospect. Much modern artillery needed a longer range than the proving ground could accommodate, and the site only had one mission: testing. That's all it did. However, the staff held out hope that because of their efficiency and location, the axe would not fall. When the decision was finally made, it came through a process almost as secretive as when the proving ground was created. Even the top-ranking civilian hadn't been told.
We had not a clue. I'm pulling in the big blue parking lot when it announces on the radio that JPG is put on a closure list. That's how I found it out. And that's when I found it out.
Well, 41, I believe, is when they fired the first round, so they must have took it over in 39 or 40, government. And then less than 50 years, which is to me seems not like an average person's lifetime. They were saying, we really don't need you now.
I think the bank in DuPont told me that I think there was like 136 mortgages on houses that people had that were having to leave. Now this wasn't on the program, this was out in the community because of course when we lost our job here and you had a mortgage, that was kind of rough the second time. So folks have had a rough time here a lot of times.
It was some of the saddest days you ever could imagine.
When the Proving Ground was created back in 1941, the local civilians, for the most part, hadn't dared challenge the government. But this time, the employees and the local community took action. They formed the JPG Survival Committee and started lobbying.
They haven't done a thing in 10 years on bases, and this is why this commission was created, to get Congress off the hook. But now you're on the hook again.
The thing I want to know is the federal government willing to take their part of the tax base and replenish Jefferson County for it?
Many employees were bitter about the process. BRAC commissioners hadn't been allowed to contact the installation, hadn't even visited them to learn anything firsthand.
I'm on my application by any means, but I think it'll show you that laying all cleanup costs aside, that it's still a very bad move today.
We could not submit correct data to replace the data. They didn't want to be confused with no facts. See?
In order for a facility to close, the government had to show that the cost of closing and moving its operations could be recovered in less than 6 years. But the math varied depending on who added up the cost.
And it's just honest people can disagree as to how much it's going to cost to build something out over a 5-year period. Estimates can easily vary by 50% or 100%.
While the Base Closure Commission figured on selling the land for $25 million and recovering the cost of moving the facilities within 6 years, other government agencies, the GAO, estimated it would take up to 200 years at least to recover the costs. Staff at the Proving Ground looked at the cleanup costs and figured it would cost more than $5 billion to get the property cleaned up enough to sell.
Lee Hamilton got us an interview with Les Aspin, who was the Secretary of Defense at that time. So we took this big topographic map of the Proving Ground and we showed him all my figures. We told him it cost $5 billion to clean the place up. And we spent about 45 minutes talking to him, and then when we left, I could hear him say to Lee Hamilton, he said, let's see, the Army's crazy as hell as they think they're going to get $5 billion to clean that place up.
In the end, the government cleaned up only a small part of the land, about 4,000 acres at the southern end. Ken Knuff remains as the Army site manager.
A lot of people had the perception that there were no firing positions south of the firing line, that all the bullets came north, but turns out there were some positions down south that were either had been forgotten or kind of ignored. There was one mortar field that they cleaned up, just a few acres, where they ended up cleaning up 37,000 mortar rounds from that one small field.
That land was sold to a local developer for only $5 million. This area has been turned into an industrial park with a railroad and several small businesses. Another 1,000 acres is used by the Indiana Air Guard for air-to-ground testing.
Now what has happened, the government is stuck with 50,000 acres that are plus that they can't never get rid of. That's impossible. They sold this south end for $5 million. It has cost in the neighborhood of $200 million to close JPG down. They're still spending millions every day on this place. So the whole thing turned out to be the bottom line to it is politics. Had nothing to do with economics, had nothing to do with efficiency. This was the most efficient operating place of all government test centers.
But beyond concerns about wasting taxpayer money, Moore says the staff at JPG were worried about leaving the community with an environmental disaster. Although the closing went forward, in one respect, the JPG Survival Committee was successful. The last round was fired on September 30th, 1994, but the government agreed to not sell the 51,000 acres in the testing area and to keep monitoring the ground and water to make sure pollutants don't spread.
So I think that's our most biggest success, is that we raised enough cane, got the Environmental Protection Agency involved.
It's no surprise that years and years and years ago, the people that worked here, if they had to get rid of a solvent or a chemical, they basically would dump it in the ground. They didn't do that maliciously, that was the accepted practice at the time. So these chemicals eventually would accumulate, get into the groundwater, and stay. So those areas have to be looked at. No real plans of actively cleaning the groundwater. You'd have to do a multi-million-dollar pump and treat program.
There's a great fear that they wanted to sell the land. So the employees, we knew how dangerous it was. There have been other test ranges closed and sold. Actually, cities have grown on them. And in San Diego, they had an old Marine training base that they built houses on. The 2 kids found some mortar shells and were banging them around, and they blew up and killed the 2 kids right in the city limits of San Diego.
Unexploded ordnance litters the refuge. Missiles, mortars, bombs, grenades, small arms fire. There's also the problem of depleted uranium.
You're talking about a material there that has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, so it'll be here longer than probably the planet is. We have approximately 175,000 pounds of that material, which is still uprange. It is contained in a designated zone, and of course the public is kept away from this zone.
So most of the property will likely be left forever in no man's land. However, it's not a wasteland. Federal biologists conducted an ecological survey and found that years of Army ownership had created unparalleled wildlife habitats, not only because the land has seen decades without development. According to U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist Joe Robb, the Army testing made for even better habitat than if the property had been left in farmland.
They used fire every year to control some of the fuel that wildfires would take off when they tested the munitions. And so they had fire every year, and those old farm fields developed into really nice grasslands. Other areas they used for buffers to control some of the sounds that came from the testing. So if you have a forested buffer, it would be quieter on the outside of the proving grounds. So those areas grew up into forests. So you have large chunks of forest and large chunks of grassland that, back in the early 30s and late 30s and early 40s were just farm fields.
This created a niche for virtually every type of regional species. The grassland protects birds, Henslow sparrows, northern harriers, short-eared owls. The uplands are teeming with deer and turkey. Several streams boast high water quality, more than 40 different fish species, and numerous types of freshwater mussels, which are very endangered. Beavers have come back and are creating wetlands. Otters were introduced and are flourishing after having disappeared entirely from Indiana. A heron rookery protects more than 150 nests. The federally endangered Indiana bat is now breeding here, and the large forested border creates a birder's paradise for 120 breeding species.
Butterflies, well, we do an annual butterfly survey, and it's one of the top places in the state. We typically get hundreds of species of butterflies, and one of the largest numbers, just the number of butterflies that we count. And you think of the forest and the open fields, there's a lot of flowers, a lot of nectar-producing plants, and so that draws a lot of butterflies. And it's amazing, the numbers, and we always find something new, always find something different every time we go out.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now manages most of the property as Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge contains some of the largest contiguous forest area in the lower Midwest. 6,000 acres of wetlands, 5,000 acres of grasslands, and more than 30 caves.
The first unit we're going to do is what we call Plan Area 2.
Refuge staff set intentional fires every spring so as to continue the land management practices that created such good habitat. And they've adapted the old Army range to environmental use. The testing bunkers now serve as homes for vultures and barred owls. Transferring management of the property to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saved the government millions, maybe even billions of dollars in unexploded ordnance cleanup costs. And now, the Army is looking to terminate its license with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That will save taxpayer money, but it also means the Army would no longer be required to continue monitoring the depleted uranium left on the property.
Basically, adopt a program where the public will be kept out of this area forever and therefore minimize exposure.
Do you know that they're worried about the Iraqis now because of all the depleted uranium we fired out of our tanks? Can you imagine being worried about the Iraqis and not being concerned with right here in the middle of Indiana?
There are no plans of cleaning it up because they actually would have to clean up the conventional ordinance in addition to the DU, and that makes it a very hazardous job.
Some people thought we were crazy because of all the other issues here. We have unexploded ordnance, depleted uranium, we surround an Air National Guard range. But you look at the natural resource values, there's true sanctuary out there that no one goes. And as far as those contaminants aren't affecting the natural ecosystem, we're not as concerned about it.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does allow public use in the areas along the Refuge perimeter, the old buffer zone around the test site, where there's a smaller concentration of unexploded ordnance, although no place is completely free of danger. 20,000 visitors use the refuge annually. Bird watchers, historical groups, 400 hunters a day come during refuge hunts. Even in the buffer zone, there's a phenomenal concentration of wildlife. So good, it makes people wonder about what's in the forbidden areas. Many people lust for access. About 30,000 acres are completely closed to humans.
People think that's where the big deer are, or that's where something's hidden that they want to go look at.
Now the land belongs to no one person. Only native plants and animals are allowed free range. Over most of the property, nature is taking over, erasing signs of man, but leaving his legacy. Thousands of people displaced over the years, tens of thousands of acres left contaminated. Yet thousands of soldiers' lives protected, and now hundreds of plant and animal species being protected against extinction. Should the Army ever change its mind and try to sell the land, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has first right of refusal. So perhaps this is the last time a whole group of people will have to rebuild their lives elsewhere. At best, this land can serve as a historical, cultural, and natural resource for generations to come.